Okay, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. This class I would actually like to dedicate to someone who I did not get to know very well, although I know his wife. Um, Someone who was really, in many ways, a very saintly person. Chaim Yosef Yechiel Michel ben Nachman, who was an example to everybody of what a kind person needs to really be, a kind soul. A very big He was very big on this idea of helping out other people in whatever circumstances they found themselves. Okay, what I'm going to say tonight also has to do with the concept of souls, and I hope to come to it in the towards the end. If we have time at the end, I'll also leave some time for question and answer. It depends on how long the class goes. It might go longer than anticipated, but in any event, okay. We have been talking about the concept of Tohu and Tikun. What is Tohu? Tohu is the situation. This is mentioned right in the beginning of the book of Genesis, in the second verse of Genesis. After it talks about in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, and so on and so forth. And then it goes on to say, the land was in a state of, or the earth, the land. That's a literal translation, but it really means the physical universe was in a state of um, chaos and void, etc., etc. We explained all those terms, but the basic and most important thing we explained in last week's class, I think it was, where we discussed the concept in Kabbalah of the smashing of the vessels, or the breaking of the vessels. What does that mean? The vessels of the six sfirot, every world has 10 sfirot. That's the internal structure of every world, there's 10 sfirot. And in the world of Tohu, there was so much light that the vessels of the six emotional qualities, in other words, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod, um, smashed. They could not contain the light, and they smashed and fell into very small pieces. Malchut was also affected, but wasn't completely broken, according to the Arizal. So these vessels smashed into 288 shards, so to speak, and of those 288, 202 were rectified and elevated through the slavery of the Israelites in Egypt. Egypt was the world empire at that particular time, and or the most powerful empire at that particular time. And most of the sparks fell into that state. The sparks always fall where there is a possibility for them to be rectified. Or let me put it a little bit more precisely. Most of the sparks fall where they have a possibility of rectification, a possibility of being elevated. And since the Israelites were the ones that had to do the elevating, therefore, and they were slaves in Egypt at the time, therefore, all the sparks, or they came to be enslaved in Egypt at that time. Therefore, all the sparks were basically, at least the vast majority of them, were in Egypt. When they left Egypt, they had elevated already 202 of the 288. Okay. The question that we have to ask is, what happened when the vessels smashed? What happened to the lights that were in the vessels? That is a critical part of what I want to look at today. What happened to the light? And the answer is that the light did not smash. The light simply did not have a receptacle, a vessel, to be expressed. And therefore, it sort of remained hovering in the air for a while until the light was sort of withdrawn to a certain extent. And you'll understand why I'm saying to a certain extent when I explain a little bit more later on. Okay. Then the concept of tikkun is the idea of repairing these vessels in order to bring the light down. Um, there's no purpose in bringing the light down if there's no vessel to contain it. So one of the first things that has to be done is that the vessels have to be reconstructed. In other words, they have to be reconstructed in such a way that when the same light comes into them, or perhaps even a higher light, as the Arizal explains and explained also in the teachings of Baal Shem Tov and his successors, the light of the rectified world, the light that will be in the rectified world, will be even greater than the light of the world of Tohu. So, in order for that light to be elicited, to be drawn down, to be manifested, to be revealed, there has to be a rectification, a repair of the vessels. How are the vessels repaired? Well, there's very many ways in which the vessels can be repaired. There are many paths, but the primary path is good deeds and stemming from good qualities of character, stemming from good qualities of character of people living in this physical body and living in the world, and using themselves and their resources to do good, which repairs the vessels of the world of Tohu. And that, by the way, is what this friend who passed away, it was just his shloshim, his the 30 days. In Jewish tradition, after 30 days, there's 7 days of mourning, and then on the 30th day, there's what's called usually an askara, a remembrance, and we just had that. And this is remembering the person that I was talking about before, Chaim Yosef Yechiel Michal Ben Nachman. In any event, doing the proper acts, the acts of kindness. Now, acts of kindness could be of all sorts. Of course, it could be charitable work, but it could also just be showing kindness to somebody in the street that you don't even know. A smile, an encouraging word, helping someone to dig. I live in Chicago. Helping someone to dig their car out of the snow, and so on and so forth. Those kinds of things are kindness which may not be directly commanded as one of the commandments of the Torah, one of the 613 commandments, but we do have a commandment to look after each other, essentially. It's called V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor, your fellow as yourself. Okay, in any event, I'm sure we all understand those kinds of ideas. But there's something I want to talk about a little bit further that has to do with the repairing of the vessels, and not just the repairing of the outer form of the vessels, but the inner dimension of the vessels, which is the more important, in fact, the critical component. And that's what I want to talk about now. This week's Torah reading is called parshat Ki Tisa. Ki Tisa. It's basically to do initially with the counting, with a census and the counting of the people in the desert at that particular time. Later on in the section, it talks about when Moses had gone up to receive the tablets. Everybody heard the first two commandments on Mount Sinai that was spoken about a couple of parshas ago, a few parshas ago in Parshat Terumah. Everyone heard the 10, I'm sorry, not, in Parshat Terumah, everybody heard the 10 commandments. And then, they heard the first two commandments, and then Moses went up. The Israelites could not, the revelation was too great for them, so they told Moses, you transmit it to us, and that's what he did. And then he went up to get the two tablets of stone. While he was up, getting the two tablets of stone on which the 10 commandments were to be written, or were being written, engraved there by God, the Israelites, or at least some of the people that were with them, according to Kabbalah, it's really the Erev Rav, those people that came out of Egypt with them, who were not part of the Abrahamic family, but they were um, people who tagged along when the Israelites were released from Egypt, when they were free to leave. So there were other slaves as well who left with them. Now these slaves had not yet been fully, or maybe not even partially, rectified. And when Moses did not come back down the mountain at the time that they thought he ought to have come down, they were very worried what's going to be with their situation in the desert and so on and so forth, and they need some guidance. They need some. Anyway, they made a mistake. To put it briefly, they made a mistake. They started worshiping the golden calf, and Moses is still on top of the mountain with Joshua is just a little bit lower down. Moses on top of the mountain communing with God, and God tells him, "Your people have sinned. Go down." Meanwhile, so God obviously knows what was going on, and he tells Moses, "Go down and do what you have to do." And at that time, um, God was giving the tablets to Moses, and he was about to this is the Midrash that tells us this. God was about to withdraw the tablets from Moses' hands, because that way, since the marriage, so to speak, had not been consummated, since the marriage had not been consummated, the giving of the tablets is like the um, when Jewish people get married. So there's various ceremonies and so on and so forth, but a vital part of the ceremony is that a ketubah is written, a marriage contract. Without the ketubah, if there's no ketubah, the whole marriage is questionable. I don't want to go into the legal side of it now, but there are problems with the man and woman, the husband and wife, actually not allowed to be together if they don't have a ketubah. Ketubah is a marriage document which is in the possession of the woman, and it states the husband's obligations to the wife and what his obligations will be if they get divorced, and so on and so forth. In any event, it's called the ketubah, the this marriage contract. Now, the two tablets of stone, say the sages, were the marriage contract. So God was about to withdraw the marriage contract so that the marriage would be annulled. In other words, withdraw the two tablets of stone so that the marriage would be the marriage of God and the Israelites would be revoked. And Moses, understanding what was going on, grabbed the tablets and yanked them out of God's hands, so to speak. This is what the Midrash says. The Midrash uses very human terminology to explain very, very deep and spiritual concepts. You'll see what I'm talking about soon. So Moses grabbed the tablets, went immediately down the mountain to witness, to see um, the Israelites and the others worshiping this golden calf that they'd made, and he then and there smashed the tablets. There are opinions that he just let them drop. He was so shocked they just dropped out of his hand, but the text does not seem to support that theory, because it's afterwards when God gives him the second tablets, he tells him, "Et haluchot asher shibarta," the tablets which you broke, not that broke because you dropped them, but that you broke. So Moses actually smashed the tablets. This smashing of the tablets is a perfect parallel of the whole concept of the smashing of the vessels of the world of Tikkun. It's an exact parallel to that, but it's a parallel on a higher level. Why? Because the vessels of the world of Tohu were part of the concept of creation, of the what is called the chain of being, or the chain of descent from higher spiritual levels until eventually physical levels emerge, the material world emerges, and Tohu is part of that process. And smashing the vessels of Tohu is an interruption in the process of um, in the process of creation. It's perturbance, I think, is the word that they use in the scientific community. It's a perturbance in the dynamics of creation. Smashing the tablets was a perturbance in the spiritual realm, in the realm of the soul, the realm of the spirit. Now, you could ask the question, why was it that Moses grabbed the tablets out of God's hands, so to speak, only to smash them later on, shortly afterwards? Why did he do that? Why was that in fact a necessity? What was achieved thereby? And the answer is, what was achieved thereby was the whole possibility of perfect tikkun, of the rectification. Let me explain. When Moses broke the tablets, on the tablets were written the 10 Commandments, written by God. But actually, they weren't actually written, they were carved into the tablets. In other words, I'll approach the questions a little bit later on. The letters which were engraved into the tablets were not just engraved into them, but engraved all the way through. The sages tell us that if you read the tablets from the front, you would see the 10 Commandments. And if you read them on the back, you would still see the 10 Commandments in the right order, the right way around. There was a miraculous event that you could read the writing on both sides. It wasn't reversed on the back side of it. It was read the same way as you would normally read Hebrew, from right to left. And the letters were not reversed. They were in the right. They were in readable order. They weren't sort of back to front, miraculously. And the reason for that is that the tablets did not have the concept of rear. Everything was face. It was all face to face. So whichever side of the tablets you would look at, you would see the same face, so to speak. In other words, you would see the same surface, whichever side you would be looking at. According to the sages, the tablets were actually square. They weren't flat. They weren't oblong or whatever. They were square, and same height, same width, same depth, and so on. And could be read from both sides, from front to back, and from back. And from the back, they looked like just like the front. Okay, so what happened when Moses then broke the tablets? Obviously, these letters were smashed. What happened to the lights? The lights were not completely revoked. The lights were not completely revoked because once the tablets had been given, once the commandments had been carved into the stone, and the stone had already been given to Moses, to Moshe, therefore there was already a change in the status of the light that filled those vessels, the light that filled, in other words, the ideas, the concepts that filled those letters of the 10 Commandments. Once they had already been given, they had been manifested in creation. The whole of creation was now a completely different situation. Why? Because at the beginning of creation, it says God created the heavens and the earth. And then he made a rakia, a separation between heaven and earth. In other words, the spiritual realms and the physical realms, the material realms, were two different realms. They did not intermingle. There was a barrier between them. At the time of the giving of the Torah, at the time of when God said the 10 Commandments and then gave Moses the tablets, a fundamental change took place within creation. That barrier between heavens and earth was actually removed so that heaven could now be brought down to earth. Heaven could be brought down to earth. And that is exactly why Moses grabbed the tablets, so to speak, out of God's hands and brought them down only to smash them. Even though they were smashed, they had been brought down. Therefore, reconstituting them on this lower level into which they were brought was 100% possible. It was 100% possible. How do we do that? Um, how are the letters reconstructed? Now, just interestingly enough, a point that needs to be made, excuse me, a point that needs to be made is that all of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, I should actually explain something before that. Until the Hebrew alphabet, apparently it seems pretty clear from geological records and so on that the Hebrew alphabet was the first language that actually used an alphabet. Prior to that, there were hieroglyphics. Yes, people spoke. They spoke a language, whatever the language happened to be. Let's say the language of Egyptian, Akkadian, Hebrew, whatever it may happen to be. There were languages. Yes, there were many languages, and nevertheless, those languages were represented up until that time by some kind of hieroglyphic structure. In fact, according to the geologists and archaeologists, there were actually there were three writing patterns or three hieroglyphic patterns. Apparently, the Mayan Indians and the Egyptians, and there was some other, I don't remember which one it was now, but some other nation people that had developed some kind of written type of communication, pictograms of some sort around. Oh, I think the Chinese, actually. I think that's what it was. In any event, this was all true. Hieroglyphics were used until the Hebrew alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet was a completely new idea. You did not have to represent an idea by a picture thereof, but you could represent the idea in letters that could be used, 22 letters that could be used in any circumstances and for expressing anything and everything. This was actually a revolution. This was a tremendous. Prior to that, in order to be able to understand and communicate and write, record history or whatever, you had to know. A person had to be very, very educated. According to the scientists, in some of these hieroglyphic languages, there were 3,000 characters, 3,000 standard pictograms that would express, and in one or two of the languages, perhaps even more than that. So a person had to spend years and years and years and years learning in order to be able to express himself in some kind of written form. Along came the Hebrew alphabet, and even little children were able to start writing sentences at a very young age, 4 and 5 years old. All you had to do was learn the 22 letters and their combinations, and then you could write anything. Now, there are 22 base letters, and then there's five end letters, maybe 27 letters altogether. These 27 letters are the 27 letters that you find in the first verse of Genesis. But the entire Torah is contained in the 22 letters. In other words, from any of the letters of the first verse of Genesis, or from any of the 10 commandments, by a process that's called milui, I'll explain what that is in a minute, you can generate the entire Torah and everything else. In other words, the entire existence can be generated using these 22 letters as a sort of base DNA of creation, or the base DNA of enlightenment. Now, what I mean when I say that, excuse me, what I mean when I say that everything can be derived through the milui. So I'm going to share a screen. Here we are. let's just take, for example, can everyone see the screen? I hope you can, because I can't see your chat. So, um, in any event, I think it should be visible to everybody, right? Let me just see here 1 second. Yeah, okay. All right, so let's say you have a letter. We'll just take the first letter of the alphabet, which is the Aleph, right? The Aleph. The Aleph can be expanded by actually spelling the letter Aleph out into its full form, right? Aleph, right? That would be how you spell Aleph in Hebrew. Now you can do the same thing again. That again becomes Aleph, but Lamed is now spelled Lamed Mem Daled, and this would be spelled Pei, and that could be spelled Pei Aleph, or it could be spelled Pei Hey, or it could be spelled Pei Yud. Pei Yud, right? Pei Yud. Now all of these letters can also be filled fully. Like the Dalet, for instance, over here is then spelled Dalet Lamed Taf. Right? What does that mean? It means that each of these letters can be expanded, and then these can be expanded, and these can be, until you get a complete expansion of that would contain all the letters of the Torah in it. Okay, that's what it's all about. Okay, so therefore everything was contained therein. Once it had been brought down, once Moses had brought the tablets down, that was already manifested in reality. It was manifested not only as the creative impulse, the letters of creation, but it was manifested as the letters of enlightenment, which are on a much deeper level than the letters of creation. Creation is an outward form. Enlightenment is an inward movement, an inward form. So, Kabbalah now goes on to say that reconstituting these letters can be done in a number of different ways. Reconstituting the letters in the spiritual mode is through studying, preferably in the original, studying the Torah, and also through the prayers that were set up, that were composed by the sages. Now, studying the Torah doesn't only mean the 5 books of Moses; it means all the 24 books of the prophets. Right? Not everything was included in the 24 books of what's called the Tanakh. Tanakh is Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. The 5 books of Moses, Torah. Nevi'im is the prophets. Ketuvim is writings, or there's another name for it in English. I forget what it's called. But anyway, called Tanakh in Hebrew. That's the 24 books of the Torah. Now, there are other books as well that also have a certain level of holiness, like the book of Judith and the book of the Maccabees, and so on and so forth. There's quite a few other books, but they were not included in the canon, in the 24 books, even though they may have a certain level of holiness and are very interesting to read and very interesting historically, and so on. They were not included. Why not? Because what was included in the 24 books of the Torah is only those things. Yes, it's infinite. That's correct, Sasson. Are only those things that are a paradigm, an eternal paradigm, a paradigm that can be used by anyone, anytime, eternally. Now, what is this eternal? What does it mean that's an eternal paradigm? The stories of the Torah, although on the surface of it are just stories, historical events, that is the most external surface of the Torah that there could possibly be. But these stories, nevertheless, do tell us a lot. Even stories themselves tell us a lot about the characters of the people involved, and very often the characters which we have to attempt to emulate in one way or another. that emulation of characters in the even on the surface level is obviously going to bring a person up to a higher level of spiritual awareness and a higher level of spiritual practice. But obviously, it goes much deeper than that, to the extent that the sages expressed four modes of interpretation of scripture. And I've spoken about this before, but the simple, straightforward meaning, in other words, the text as you read it, the simple, straightforward, it's called pshat, remez, things that are hinted to on a deeper level but are not really explained. And one of the methods of remez is gematria. Gematria meaning numerical equivalent. Numerical equivalents um, are an important part of understanding things on a deeper level. And it's not only numerical equivalence; it's also the use of, let's say, what's called roshei tevot, the initial letters of a sequence of words. The initial letters of those words often spell out a very important concept. In fact, I do name analysis from time to time based on this idea that the initial letters, then the letters of a person's name, are the initial letters of consecutive words in the Torah. This is a method that was, I don't know if it was discovered by the Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, but he certainly used it. The story is told. I've told the story before, but I might as well tell it again. The story is told that he had a student, the Ramban, had a student whose name was Avner. And Avner, for whatever reason, had all kinds of questions, and his questions were not um, questions wanting to know the truth. They were questions against wanting to know. In other words, he was questioning in the way that in an inappropriate way. Let's put it that way. And eventually, he left the faith, and he completely, what the expression I use is, he fried out. He became completely a free thinker, and later on he had some regrets. Many years later, he had some regrets, and he wanted to see his teacher, and his teacher told him, "Chazor b'cha, return, come back." So he said, "Well, what would I have to do to come back? It's impossible. It's impossible for me to return." And he showed him the sequence of the letters of his name in a verse, the third letter of the words Ashbita me'enosh zichram, and so on, and it spells out the word Avner, and Amarti afahem Ashbita me'enosh zichram. That's the whole verse. Um, and he was the verse basically states that a person's name will be wiped out of memory. They will be wiped out of the divine memory. And so I said, "So what would I have to do?" He said, "Go in a place where nobody knows you and start again. Right? Go to a place where your name is not known and start all over again." All right. Anyway, to get back to to the the subject that we're talking about, reconstituting can be done by means of study, by means of prayer and meditation, and it can also be done by means of action. Part of the concept of the commandments, the 613 commandments that there are in the Torah, is exactly to do this. There are 248 positive commandments, and those reconstruct the vessels, and the 365 negative commandments, in other words, prohibitions, prevent the vessels from being broken again, or from being violated, or being damaged in some way or another. So that's another approach to reconstituting the vessels. Again, the approach that I mentioned right at the beginning, one of the approaches that's appropriate for everybody, because the 613 commandments only apply to people who are Jewish, born Jewish, or converted to Judaism. But the seven Noahide laws, which include all the basics of the Torah, but not the basic basically the Torah between man and God and between man and man. But don't include particular mitzvot like wearing fringes on the corners of your garments and things like that, and eating kosher. It doesn't include that. Now, the ability to harmonize with the inner aspects of another person's soul is part of the whole concept of tikkun. If all of us are, let's say, each person is a letter, each person is represented by a letter, and that is in fact the case. Each person is represented by a letter. Putting those letters together, in other words, bringing people together, bringing souls together, bringing friends or even people who don't know each other, bringing them together is reconstituting letters in a what can be a very beneficial format, not only beneficial for each of the parties, but beneficial for the world in general. Part of that idea is obviously when a husband marries a wife, or a wife marries a husband, however you want to put it, when two people marry, that same thing is also happening. The two souls, two interdimensional aspects are really coming together and they're making a new word. In other words, the letter that I possess and the letter that my wife possesses, whichever those letters may happen to be, come together, and then hopefully we produce children, which then becomes the extension of the original two letters. Those two letters become extended into a whole family eventually into a whole sentence, maybe a paragraph, maybe a whole parsha, whatever you want to say. So the idea the idea then of tikkun is a tikkun that everybody can do, is to find harmony with another soul. It's particularly important to attempt to find harmony with souls of people who we don't necessarily get along with at first glance. Now, it can happen that you don't get along with somebody because it's impossible to get along with them. There are such people. I know such people also. But trying to get these souls together, ones that maybe even oppose each other, and make something constructive out of it, is a very useful exercise in bringing about the tikkun. The person that I mentioned at the beginning of this class was that kind of person. He was able to bring disparate people together and all kinds of different people together and sort of harmonize them in an amazing way. In any event, after the tablets were broken, the letters had already been brought down, and those letters are essentially our souls. Those souls were now able to be reconstituted because the letters had already been brought down. In other words, spirituality had already been brought into the physical world, so that there was a fundamental change and it couldn't go back. You couldn't unsee what you saw. You couldn't undo what had been done. And therefore, Moses grabbed the tablets, he brought them down in order that we'd be able to have this ability to bring about the tikkun. And again, different people do the tikkun in different ways. There are many different ways of tikkun, as I said before, through Torah study, and there's the very various levels of Torah study, through prayer, through doing good deeds. And hopefully the vessels will be reconstructed very soon, and then we'll see the eternal light once again descending into them and into us, essentially. And that'll be the time of what the Torah calls the Messianic era. That'll be the Messianic era when that happens. Okay, I'm going to answer a few questions now. We can do Q&A. If anyone wants to write a question in the chat, you're welcome to do so. I hope I'll have a few minutes at least to address some of the questions, and we'll take it from there. Ernest asked the first question: does everything on Earth have one or more sparks, no matter what It is even rocks. Yes. The answer to that is yes, and that is why Moses was told on one occasion to hit the rock in order to bring forth its water. On the other occasion, he was told to speak to the rock and bring forth its water. Unfortunately, he hit them on both occasions, which messed things up a little bit. But yes, it is the fact that that the letters of anything that exists has within it this original creational DNA, which is a certain string of letters which are actually found in the first, essentially the first chapter of Genesis. Um, okay. Second question. If a person is born of a biological parent but raised and taught by a surrogate parent, whose letters does that child reflect? Generally, the child is born with its own letter. It's born with its own letter. Yes, it comes through the parents, but the parents are merely, I shouldn't say merely, that's not the correct way to put it. Parents play an extremely important role. And but the vessels are essentially a conduit, let's put it that way, for the birth of that particular child, and the child is its own letter. Yes, it's true that the letters of the parents together with the letters of the child constitute, let's say, a word. Um, but what happens when the parents pass away? Well, that word still remains, but now another one is started by the child, who then, let's say, marries and has their children and so on, and the words continue. The process, the creative process continues, which is why, in fact, the first, essentially the first mitzvah, the first um, commandment in the Torah is pru urevu, be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth. Okay. I hope that answers the question. Ben asks the difference between repairing the vessels and releasing the divine sparks. Okay. Releasing or elevating the divine spark. Well, what this basically is the following. There are always two components, just as ourselves, we have a soul, or if you want to call it consciousness, and we have a body. The two of them obviously work together in harmony, but in some cases, the necessity is to rectify the body. In some cases, that would be the idea of repairing the vessels. However, releasing the divine spark usually means that an entity, a physical object, when it is used for a divine purpose, then the spark that is in it is released to a higher order. It doesn't mean necessarily that the thing will then disappear, although that can, in fact, happen. It can, in fact, happen that when a rectification has been completed, then that thing just disappears. When I say disappears, it gets lost, it gets recycled, it gets uh, somehow into somebody else's possession for them to do what they need to do with it, and so on and so forth. But the rectification, or rather the release of that spark, is that the spark is now taken to a higher level. Initially, the spark continues to enliven that vessel. It's not necessarily going to continue for a long time. It may, but the elevation of the spark is that's called releasing the divine spark. So repairing the vessels is actually dealing with the thing that contains the spark, and elevating the spark or releasing the spark is moving it up to a higher level of purpose. Hope that's answers the question. Yal asks, how and when does the soul rectify and merit a higher level? In other words, from nefesh to ruach. Okay, so how does a person get to a higher spiritual realm? Well, it starts off like this. Let's say one's living in the world of action. In other words, the most important thing for your current rectification, let's say, is proper action. When that proper action is then done with the right emotional impetus behind that, that's the difference between nefesh, simply action, and ruach, which is an emotional aspect which is invested in the actions. Right? When one starts to invest emotional aspects in actions and one knows how or learns how to perfect that, in other words, to do things with the right love and awe, which are the two main attributes of the emotional attributes. When one learns to do that, then the soul comes to be um, lifted up to that higher level. Then beyond that, the even higher level than that, the level of intellect. In other words, searching out the underlying meaning and the underlying intellectual ramification. Now, ramification is not the right word. The intellectual structure of that thing. What's its purpose in the world? What's its meaning? Why is it there, and so on and so forth. And then there's a level beyond that as well, which is called the level of keter, which is essentially has to do with self-sacrifice. Now, self-sacrifice doesn't mean jumping into the fire. Self-sacrifice means giving up something that you like or enjoy or whatever for a higher cause. Hope that answers it. Okay. At the end of this current era, measured in Hebrew years, we have a few centuries left. Yeah, we're in 5,781 years right now, and but the 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 sixth, the seventh millennium, the year 6,000 is it's a marker. It's not necessarily a barrier. In other words, things can happen earlier than that. It doesn't have to be necessarily. Um, but it does end an era, and then the messianic era has to start by then. Yes, it has to start by then, but it could begin earlier. There are some signs that the messianic era is a lot closer than we think, but it's very hard for us to know exactly because there are too many variables and too many things can change. So, but things are starting to look more um, positive than they used to. Let's put it that way. Hopefully. Okay. Who's that combined with a child to form a new world? The biological or the surrogate parents? Um, initially, initially it's the biological parents, but if the parents don't bring up the child, part of bringing up a child is not only bringing them into the world, but actually educating them. If surrogate parents start to educate a child, then they imbue that child with their own letters. In other words, if they educate the child right and they do a good job of it, then they imbue the child with their structure, with their let's call it with their verse. Hopefully, that would be the way to put it. The tikkun be the necessity of getting along with the soul, someone you don't get along with in the first glance. Do you have advice for one how to approach someone you do not get along with in the first place, at first pass, at your own fault, but you believe you have a lot of potential together, and if said person is willing to try to get guidance for navigating that process most successfully. Um, Let me put it to you this way, Justin. Um, Usually, we can only do what depends on us. People make a mistake. I'm having a very long and difficult conversation with certain people regarding vaccines and so on and so forth. It's just current order of the day, but people sort of express themselves like vehemently that you know one way or the other, and to the extent that I'm just giving an example, to the extent that people will say, you know, they'll call somebody who's anti-vaccine for whatever reason there may be a murderer, right? And you know, that kind of thing. So my advice to those people is calm down, do what you can do. If you want to take the vaccine and you think it's safe and you think it's the right thing to do, in conjunction with your your medical advisors and so on, so go ahead, but don't bother other people. Don't force other people into your way of thinking. You do what you have to do, and to a certain extent, the same thing with interrelationships with other people. You do the best you can to make an opening, but don't try and change the other person. You have to change yourself to a certain extent in order to be able to open the door. Let's put it that way. People are very sensitive to things. They understand things much better than we think. If anyone's brought up, if anyone has young children, and has been manipulated by the young children, which happens to all of us, I think, you'll see that even very young people learn cues and clues as to how to. Um, what's the Dale Carnegie book called again? Win friends and influence people, or win enemies and influence people. People have a way of knowing these things. Uh, you know, it's hard to fake it. If you really don't like the person, it's hard to fake it. But you can at least be cordial and receptive and respectful, and so on. And that's the best way to go. Yeah, these things are usually best discussed. Giving details, which we don't have it's not the right forum for them, but that would be probably the best way to approach it. Your question has to do, says Yael, has to do with the concept of Gilgul. All right. I think we need to do a class on Gilgul or Gilgulim. Gilgulim means reincarnations. And it's also part of the whole story of Tikkun. The concept of Gilgulim, there's Gilgul, there's Ibur, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to talk about. We'll do it in a future class. If Yael, if you wouldn't mind reminding me, then we'll do that probably after Passover. Terry, is it that each ticket is a certain adversity or challenge to overcome, and it takes friction to create the light to overcome it? Yes, generally that's the way it is, but it depends. It depends on the soul. Very lofty souls did not have that challenge to overcome in themselves. The challenge was to overcome the barriers in the other people, but that's only for lofty souls to do. Our work is generally with ourselves. So light is always the same, but shines differently as we enlighten our path. Not sure what you really mean by the takes friction to create the light. So the light is always the same. I'm not sure that the light is always the same. I don't know. I'd have to think about that. I don't know. It depends what you mean by that. Let's put it that way. In other words, the light between two people is not always the same. No, the light between A and B is different than the light between B and C. It's not always the same thing. It's different manifestations. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but hopefully at least part of it. Is there an obvious change in behavior of the world of Tikkun in this world of Tikkun? In other words, is it possible to recognize that person in other Gilgulim? Yes, it is possible, but you have to have the eyes for it. You have to know. The Arizal could just look at a person. Interestingly enough, let me put it to you like this: who the person is written on their foreheads for for tzaddikim to see. You might not be happy about that, but that's the way it is. A, a highly spiritual person, a Kabbalist tzaddik, can look at the person, you can see like who he is already. The truth is, that most of us have this in an intuitive sense, but um, we are easily fooled, and we're not trained in being able to recognize what it is that we're seeing when we see it. Let's put it that way. So it can be seen, but you have to know what you're looking at, and you have to know how to interpret it, etc. Okay, has the Battle of Gog and Magog ended or begun? I don't think it's ended, but it seems to have begun. Yes, the Battle of Gog and Magog is the final battle of good against evil, evil against good. And has it begun? Yeah, I believe it has. Has it ended? Nope. Is it going to end soon? Hard to say. It depends. Depends on what we do. But with a little help from above, it's hopefully will be over quite soon. Yes. Yes, Cain had a mark on his forehead. Yes, after the sin. But we all have marks on our forehead. Terry says in the Zohar, much is written on facial markings and reading them. I think yes, you are right, 100%. That is in the Zohar, Ken. Yeah, and there is there's a Torah of facial reading, and then there's a science of facial reading. You know, there's um, people who are completely secular, have nothing to do with Judaism, even can learn to recognize these things. There's facial recognition, not just software, but facial recognition experts that are able to tell. For instance, lawyers hire these people quite often to be able to detect when a person is lying, when a witness is lying, or fooling themselves, or whatever. And these experts have learned it's a science. It's a science of when you see. There's actually I get videos from time to time from a person. I think her name is Cindy, if I'm not mistaken, who actually is very much like this. She watches people and tells you like basically what they're thinking. It's very interesting. In any event, yes, it's a matter of training. You can pick a lot of these things up in training, but that's what you can pick up. What we can pick up through training is what's going on in the mind. What you can't pick up through training is what's going on in the soul. For that you have to be a Kabbalist, and a trained one at that. Did I translate? I translated part of the Zohar into English. Yeah, just selections of the first few parashiot of the Zohar. I was going to continue, but it's a very time-consuming labor, and I had to provide for a family, so I didn't finish. I am actually doing one now, the Zohar on the Song of Songs. I'm almost finished. In fact, I'm just doing the last few verses. Probably tomorrow I'll get to maybe one or two verses. By the end of next week I should be finished. And that's the Zohar on Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, which is called, the Song of Songs is called the Holy of Holies and the Secret of Secrets. The secrets of the Song of Songs are incredibly deep. So that was the Zohar on that. Yes, I wish I would have had the opportunity to be able to translate the entire Zohar into English, but making a living got in the way. All right. Seeing the positive even in the worst situation was the teaching of the Rebbe. That's correct. The rectification and a tikkun, indeed it is. How can we find the light that seems to be only in what seems to be only darkness? That's a very good question, and it needs to be expanded on. But darkness is not only darkness. There is darkness, and there's darkness. There's darkness which is the absence of light, and there's darkness that conceals the light. Darkness, they have to be dealt with in a different way. Each has to be dealt with in a different way. There's the darkness that was the absence of light, so you bring light into that darkness, into that situation. Darkness that conceals light is darkness that's waiting to be transformed into light. What is the practice? There are a lot of, yes, that's correct, Hank. Thank you. um, what is the practice? There are a lot of, in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, in the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, you will find a lot of practices. Now, if you're asking for, it's a way of looking at things largely. It's a way of looking at things. Um, it's when I say a way of looking at things, doesn't mean to say what strength your glasses are, or how you look at something in a physical sense. It means your mindset when you look at something. How do you think about it, and how does it impact you, and how do you impact it? There are certain people that allow themselves to be far too impacted by events that are going on around them, and they're sort of very receptive to those events. Such people have to be taught to be more active, in other words, not just receptive, but active. In other words, putting their stamp on things around them rather than letting things around them stamp them. Anyway, it's a whole class. That itself is a whole class. If you want to remind me, Ben, you're welcome to do that, and we'll talk about that in a future class as well. All right, we seem to have come to the ends of the questions. Okay, we'll call it a night. Have a great weekend, everybody. Absolute light, you add light. When light is concealed, you expose the light. Yes. Good. All right. Have a good one, everybody. Shabbat Shalom for those of you who observe the Sabbath. Have a great weekend for those of you who don't, and or don't yet. And we will see each other hopefully next week. All the best.